When I was in divinity school in North Carolina, our program had developed a tradition around graduation each year. Just before graduation, we would have a big party to celebrate everyone who was graduating. There was food, of course, but also some fun. The graduating third year students would leave gifts for the first and second year students who were following in their footsteps. And the first and second year students would write a very silly play where all the characters were members of the graduating class. In my class, that was about 24 people. So it's a small program. Don't be imagining like the entire School of Social Work in Chicago or something. It was about 24 students. The more junior students would volunteer also to not just write, but act the part of the outgoing students in the play. It was a successful play when the writers and actors managed to either capitalize on a well-known story about a particular student, or when the actor managed to portray somebody's common mannerisms and clothing style particularly well. Catherine was the woman who portrayed me in the weeks before my graduation, and she captured some key behaviors of mine with such clarity that me and my classmates laughed out loud. I had longer hair, for example. I had longer hair than I wear right now, and had this habit of running my fingers through my hair like this and making a big mess during particularly passionate theological debates. She did that the entire time she played Chrissy during the play. I also always carried these little tiny woven purses that I couldn't carry now because I need a place where I can put a cell phone and my wallet and a notebook and my keychain full of church keys. Catherine found a purse just like mine, and she wore it. And during my third year in divinity school, I kind of went on a knitting kick, and I knitted all over Wake Forest's campus, including in my pastoral care class. As Catherine played Chrissy up on stage in a Baptist church in town, she held knitting needles and yarn, and she may have even knitted a little bit. I don't remember, but she was pretty committed to the whole thing. One of the main reasons we did this play was to demonstrate that we paid close enough attention to one another so that we knew how each other moved, we knew what each other wore, and we knew the things that each other was passionate about. You may have heard something about imitation being a kind of flattery. We were using imitation to indicate intimacy. We could playfully pretend to be one another because we knew each other and we cared about each other. When Catherine knitted and raked her hand through her hair, I saw something I recognized, and it brought me great joy. A couple of weeks ago, Tasha and I watched the new film version of Little Women. And one of the things I liked best about the movie is this riot of movement and sound that the four March sisters are when they are together. I don't know if you've seen it yet, but I heartily recommend it. There's this one scene where the sisters travel to a neighbor's house, meeting him and his grandson and another young man for the first time. The sisters all talk the whole time. They talk over each other and at each other and through each other, and they gain energy from one another as they engage with this kind man and these two bewildered boys. As the sisters leave in a tornado of goodwill and kindness, one of the boys, the one who had had the hardest time keeping up in conversation and who had utterly failed, he looked like he had just run a 5K. He was wore out, and all he had been trying to do was have a conversation. Tasha looked at the sisters, and she looked at that blown over boy, and then she looked at me and she said, "Chrissy, that's what you and your mom and your sisters are like when you get going." And she is exactly right. That is just like how me and mom and the two sisters that I grew up with That's just how we are when we get on a tear. We are a force of nature. I finished that movie imagining that the director, Greta Gerwig, might have had sisters and a mom like mine, because she created this family that I recognize, even if it's not exactly like my own. Again, here was this place where I had a surprise of recognition that brought me great joy. As I've listened to people talk about what is hard about traumatic events, some of what is most frustrating is the way that trauma disrupts what is familiar and comfortable. I mean, let's think about our own current experiences with the stay-at-home policies that we're living in. Even as we know that we need to practice social distancing, we're missing both the normal and celebratory stuff that we used to do every day. For example, I follow a COVID-19 mutual aid group on Facebook, and a significant portion of the requests are from parents who are trying to make their kids' birthdays feel as normal as possible. They ask other parents for ideas, and the parents share them quickly. And then strangers offer to send cards and sometimes whole toys to the kids. Anything that helps it feel recognizable, that helps it feel normal, that helps it look like a birthday should look. People are helping each other by sharing anything that they can to bring some joy. In our scriptures today, two of the disciples, traumatized by watching their friend be killed by the government, have already realized that nothing will feel normal for a while. And while they were walking from Jerusalem to Emmaus and talking about all the things that had happened over the last couple days, it is clear that there is much on their hearts. At this point in the story in the book of Luke, these two disciples had heard about the resurrection from the first women preachers and from Peter, who had gone to check on the tomb himself. But the disciples hadn't seen Jesus yet. So they have this sense that something amazing has happened and it's incredible, but they don't know what to believe. They are still so unsure. As I read this story, I often wonder how distracted they have to be to not recognize that the man who joins them on the walk is Jesus. And then I remember that grief makes things harder than they normally are, and so I cut these disciples some slack. The stranger Jesus asks them what was happening and what they were talking about, and these men, bewildered, ask if this man who was walking with them was the only person in the world who hadn't heard what had been happening in Jerusalem. And so he told them. They told him about the life and teachings and death of this prophet they had been following called Jesus of Nazareth. And they even went on to tell him about the resurrection sermon they had heard. It was clear, though, they weren't sure what to believe. And if you'll notice, and you heard, the stranger was surprised and probably annoyed that they were so slow to believe. He began to teach them, to interpret the law for them, telling them again what the Messiah means. This is another place where I don't understand why they don't recognize this as Jesus. Nearly all of the time he spent with them was teaching. Wouldn't they recognize their teacher doing the thing he did most well? Surely they would have heard these familiar lessons repeated and realized that it was their teacher with them. But this is not where they feel the jolt of recognition. Not yet. I'm glad Anna got to read the part where they recognize Jesus. You see, the disciples got to Emmaus, and the stranger was going to go ahead of them, but the two disciples stopped him. They learned at least one important thing from Jesus. You always offer someone a safe place to stay. And so they invite this stranger to stay with them, and he does. And then they sit down to dinner, and the stranger Jesus did something that you might recognize. I know I do. He took the bread, and he blessed it, and he broke it, and he gave it to them. Who among us has heard those words before? Who among us have said those words during worship? In that moment, they know who he is. In that moment of compassion and care and grace, it is clear who this man before them is. It says their eyes were opened and they recognized him. But then he vanishes. But that's not the end of the story. They use this line that I think is particularly lovely. They said, "Were not our hearts burning within us while he was talking on the road?" Were our hearts not burning? It makes me think that they were kind of recognizing him there, but they just weren't ready for it yet. Once they realize what has happened and once Jesus has disappeared, they run 7 miles back to Jerusalem. I don't know that I have ever run 7 miles in my whole life. They run 7 miles back to Jerusalem and they tell the rest of the disciples what they had experienced. What a new and strange joy that must have been. You've probably got your own 7-mile walk to Emmaus and your own trauma that may have affected how you see new life that joins you along the way. I know I do. I can struggle with how to recognize the risen Christ in the midst of death and disruption. Thank God that this story is here to remind us that in acts of grace and hospitality, in blessing and sharing, we will come to see Jesus sitting right here with us. In fact, we'll understand that he's been here all along. I've got one more story to tell you this morning. Andrew Cuomo, the governor of New York, shared this story on Friday. A retired farmer named Dennis, we don't know Dennis's last name. Governor Cuomo's office blacked it out to save his anonymity. But a retired farmer named Dennis had sent him a letter all the way from Kansas, where Dennis and his wife live. In the letter, Dennis shared that he knows the governor is busy and that this whole country, and in fact the world, is in the midst of a crisis. And so he won't be offended that Cuomo may not actually read this letter by himself. But Dennis just appreciates the work that he's been doing. Dennis also talks about his own life. He shares that he is in the age demographic that is particularly affected by COVID-19 and that his wife has respiratory problems. He tells the truth about what's going on for him, that he's afraid for his wife. It is important, though, to note that he is not letting his fear stop him from being a good neighbor. The final paragraph of this fairly short letter reads, "Enclosed, find a solitary N95 mask left over from my farming days. It has never been used. If you could, would you please give this mask to a nurse or a doctor in your city?" Dennis keeps 4 of these masks for himself when he finds them on the farm. He knows that his immediate family will need them. But he has 1 mask left. And he knows that someone else, particularly someone in a state as hard hit as New York is, could use it. And so rather than squirrel it away, he sends it on. Grace and hospitality in the face of fear. Blessing and sharing with strangers. I've heard this story before. It looks like Jesus to me. Things are not normal right now. But the presence of Christ is still familiar. I hope this week that you feel a joyful recognition of realizing that Christ is in your midst. Whether you are in Emmaus or Kansas or right at your house in Maine or Maryland. Amen.